G'day folks, Brother Rob with you again. Now I posted about it briefly on to my Twitter account yesterday, but I think it bears repeating, and this was why, of course, I'm doing a video on it as well here on YouTube. So what I want to address is something I read in Dr. Bart Ehrman's book entitled Jesus Before the Gospels, and something about the introduction of this book, and I can't remember exactly where, but he said that something along I'm paraphrasing, okay, but Dr. Bart Ehrman, if you see this video, which probably is unlikely, but anyways, if you do see this, Dr. Bart Ehrman, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm willing to take the heat for that. Okay, so in Dr. Bart Ehrman's introduction in his book entitled Jesus Before the Gospels, he makes some rather interesting observations and comments regarding human memory, both in good terms and bad terms, in terms of how it can be trusted in some ways and completely distrusted in others, which, by the way, thinking person, myself included, would readily and easily affirm that. However, I'm going to kind of unpack this and just see where it leads. And I'm, of course, the thread that I put on my Twitter handle yesterday, if you read it, it's going to be pretty much what I'm going to go through right now. So, but anyways, sometimes textual works for some people. Sometimes a visual like this works for others, or maybe some combination thereof. But anyways, okay, let's go to it. So, Dr. Bart Ehrman said, again, to paraphrase in the introduction of his book entitled Jesus Before the Gospels, that if you have eyewitness testimony and it's transmitted through word of mouth from one person to one person to one person to one person to another person, or person to person to person to person, and by the time it gets penned down and put on ink, if you will, is about 40 years later, and the first gospel being Mark, it may have been the case that between that link in transmission between the early eyewitness testimonies and when it got penned on paper and become the Gospel of Mark that we know to this day, that some things may have been invented, some things may have been altered, and some things may have been fudged along the way, if you will. So, okay, I mean, to which I would say that's possible, but where I think Dr. Ehrman has overstated or emphasized, if I will, the validity of that argumentation and line of reasoning is the precise event in question, being a bodily resurrection. And because a bodily resurrection doesn't happen like ever, I think it's highly unlikely and unusual that even between the eyewitness testimony and the transmission link between when the early eyewitness testimonies begin to spread the word of Jesus to those who hear them, and those who hear them pass them on, so on and so forth, until Mark's gospel got penned, and what we know to be to this day. That a bodily resurrection, even given that amount of time and transmission, seems highly unlikely and unusual for it to be invented, fudged, altered, or all three, or some combination thereof. And that's where I believe that Dr. Ehrman has shot himself in the foot, so to speak. Okay, the next thing I want to bring to attention is the fact that we have early documentation of the people, some of the people, three of those people I'm just going to name, Peter, James, and John, to whom that we have historical narrative and record of some of the things and around surrounding both the life of Christ and a lot of events that followed because of it, and willing to lay their lives down for it. So let's start with Peter. Okay, Peter was a disciple of Jesus Christ, and spent, as far as we know, roughly 3 years in personal ministry with Jesus, and he, as well as James and John, would have been able to conclusively verify one way or the other whether in fact Jesus hadn't risen from the dead or not, because he was alive at the same time. So if Jesus hadn't risen from the dead, as the Gospels and New Testament epistles from the Gospels on to the end of the book of Revelation, had made the story of the resurrection of Christ up, it doesn't seem to make much sense that Peter and as well as James and John would have did the things they did, spoken the things or written the things they did, spoken the things they did, and were willing to give their lives for it, which all three of them did. That's my knowledge, and have a way of verifying that the resurrection hadn't happened to begin with. Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Like, it doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Not only that, okay, as a way of example, the Watergate scandal in the USA gives us a good indication as a way of induction for my argument that if you take people and put them in isolation and apply a certain amount or a lot amount, in that case, from what I gather, or if I remember vaguely, if you put them under enough mental, physical torture, some combination or other, which is, plays that can and often does play tricks on the mind, as to why you would hold to something that isn't true if it wasn't. It doesn't, like, the guys in the Watergate scandal eventually cracked under the weight of their psychological, physical torture, both of them, and eventually just recanted the whole thing. And this is a scandal that just blew blew the whistle right off, so to speak, in terms of the corruption that went on during that scandal. And they recanted the things that they were saying, maybe to some degree, or entirely, I'm not really sure, but there definitely was enough of a testimony of recantation, if that's a word, but the recant of the things that they held to at first to the things that they held to after said physical and mental torture, that they did eventually come to tell the things that did happen. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that if I go use that example and bring that to light in terms of the people in the Gospels and then consequently the New Testament authors and followers of Christ collectively, what we find just the opposite in the biblical canon in the New Testament, and from that point on to the rest of the Bible, and which ends in the book of Revelation. We find that Peter, James, John, and more people that I can possibly mention, which doesn't really matter for the sake of argument, but that it happened, and you can read the Gospels and epistles yourself and find out that it's quite and conclusively irrefutable truth that they were willing to give their lives for the torture they received, for the threats they received, for you name it, like any kind of pressure in any way, shape, or form that was applied to them or threatened to them. They simply didn't recant of the testimony that Jesus had in fact risen from the dead, and that's just that, and they were willing to give their lives for it. Now, if you think about the Watergate scandal that I've mentioned, and you think about the fact of the early church, 1st century AD, and some of the men that have mentioned in this video already, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense or stand up to scrutiny using logical induction and psychological reasoning as to why people didn't recant. Again, if you have men like Peter, James, and John who could have, and easily probably did, conclude that Jesus hadn't in fact risen from the dead, and then still decided to lay their lives down for him if they knew for fact it was a made up lie. Like, it just doesn't hold up to the weight of scrutiny, logical induction, or psychological reasoning, whatsoever. Now, people can, and often do, and will continue to do until the end of time, give their lives up for a lie that they don't know to be a lie, because they didn't have, as the guys that I mentioned, the ability to verify conclusively one way or another whether or not the events or convictions or both that they're holding to are verifiably true or not. But that's not the case with Peter, James, and John. So even in that kind of reasoning, it really, in my personal opinion, destroys Ehrman's case around this thing altogether. Now, I'm not sure if this is true, but this is something I didn't mention in my Twitter thread, but I'm going to mention now because it's actually kind of important. And I don't know for certain, but I know I've heard it from guys like Dr. William Lane Craig on YouTube, that we have a source document in the New Testament that actually it comes to us a lot earlier than Gospel of Mark, and that is Paul's address to the church of Corinth in 1 Corinthians 15:3-5, which Dr. William Lane Craig has actually mentioned that has actually been dated possibly. And then again, I don't know for certain, because this is going back a couple thousand years, to about 2 years to 5 years after the resurrection had been happened. So only 2 to 5 years from Jesus rising from the dead to Paul penning that exhortation that we know of in 1 Corinthians 15:3-5. So that destroys Ehrman's argument, if in fact there was 40 years, because you have Paul writing that text that we know from in 1 Corinthians 15:3-5 within possibly 2 and at most 5 years after the event in question. So I think Ehrman's argumentation is fatally and fundamentally flawed, and Dr. Bart Ehrman, or anyone who knows of his work, you're willing to hold my feet to the fire, so to speak, and hold me accountable if and when you watch this video and find that I'm in error. And I'm totally willing to do that. But I think for everything I've mentioned in this video, Dr. Bart Ehrman, I have a lot of respect for you in the fact that you are someone who actually has historical knowledge about Jesus, and you actually hold to the fact, regardless of what people say about you or to you and online or whatever, that Jesus did in fact was in fact a historical figure. Where I strongly feel that you fail in the things that I've mentioned are just that, the things I mentioned in this video. So anyways, I'm no scholar. I'm just I'm just a thinking person, a Bible-believing follower of Christ, and trying to bring some scholarly consensus and logical deduction into the things in the case that I brought into this video. And that's all I'm trying to do. And yeah, that's it. All right. Peace out, Brother Rob.